There are places in the world where nothing seems to move too fast, where neighbors still know each other by name, where streets are quiet enough to hear a conversation through an open window, and where a woman walking to the corner shop is nothing unusual. Lightcliffe in West Yorkshire, England, is exactly that kind of place. Tucked into the hills, it carries the kind of stillness that makes people feel safe. For Dawn Walker, it was home, and home she believed was where she was loved. Dawn was 52 years old. She had 3 children and a grandchild she adored. People who knew her described her the same way, over and over, without even realizing they were doing it. Generous, warm, the kind of person who would hand over the last bit of money in her purse if someone needed it more. Her daughter Cody said she was a beautiful soul who would do anything for anybody. Neighbor called her chirpy and full of energy. Dawn moved through life with a brightness that people remembered long after she had left the room. She had also known hardship. Life had not always been simple or steady, but Dawn carried herself with a kind of resilience that those around her came to rely on. She was the fixed point in her family's world, the person you called when things went wrong, the one who showed up and stayed. That was who Dawn Walker was. In 2019, she met Thomas Nutt on Facebook. He was 45 years old, a scrap metal dealer, and by most accounts, he came across as easygoing, sociable, the kind of man who blends into a group without friction. People described him as one of the boys. He was warm on the surface, attentive in those early weeks, and Dawn, like anyone searching for connection, responded to that warmth. The two grew close. They moved in together. Their relationship settled into what looked, from the outside, like a normal life in a quiet neighborhood. But there was someone else who knew Thomas Nutt from before, someone who had spent 10 years inside the version of him that the outside world never saw. Kimberly had been with Thomas since 2005. They had met at a traveling fairground in Nottinghamshire and moved in together quickly, the way people do when everything feels urgent and new. They had 3 children. And for years, Kimberly lived inside a world that was controlled, monitored, and punctuated by violence. She was isolated from her family and friends. She was beaten in front of her children. She was left with nothing of her own, financially or emotionally, because that was exactly how he needed it to be. In 2015, she was asleep when he came upstairs, sat on top of her, and began strangling her. She fought back. She screamed and ran. He caught her downstairs and continued. Her 5-year-old daughter was the one who made him stop. The sound of a child's scream was the only thing that broke through whatever had taken hold of him in that moment. Thomas was convicted of assault that year. Kimberly moved into a safe house and was granted a non-molestation order. She had survived, but she carried something forward from those years that would never fully leave her. A knowledge of what Thomas Nutt was capable of when no one was watching. When Dawn reached out to Kimberly in July 2020, wanting to understand why the non-molestation order existed, it was already a sign that something was wrong in her own home. Thomas had told her the order came from Kimberly cheating on him. Kimberly told her the truth. She described his pattern, his duality, the way he could be tender and then explosive, the way his anger would lock in and nothing would reach him once it did. She called it a Jackal and hired character, 2 faces that never quite lined up. Dawn listened. She understood. She had already been living it. By August 2021, she sent Kimberly another message. She said Thomas had tried to suffocate her. She said he had attacked her and only stopped when he saw the blood and panicked. These were not the words of someone living in confusion, she said. These were the words of someone who knew exactly what was happening to her and was quietly trying to find a way to say it out loud. In the months that followed, family members saw the marks on her. Friends noticed the changes. Thomas had been chipping away at her sense of self for years by then, the way abusers do, slowly and methodically, not in a single dramatic moment, but in 100 small ones. A comment here, an argument there. The gradual narrowing of her world until he was at the center of it, and everyone else felt distant or unreachable. 2 months before the wedding, a neighbor heard screaming coming from the house. Screaming, he said, he had never heard from a woman before. Thomas tried to tell him it was an asthma attack, and then through the noise came Dawn's voice, cutting through whatever version of events Thomas was constructing. "Do not believe him," she said. "He is lying. He is trying to kill me." The neighbor heard it. He knew what it was. But the machinery of intervention moved slowly, and Thomas and Dawn were still together when October came. Dawn had reported him for domestic violence at one point. He had been arrested, charged, and held in custody because of the threat he posed. The case was later discontinued because Dawn no longer wanted to proceed. That decision, which may have felt like relief to her at the time, or like self-protection, or like the impossible calculation that every person in her position is forced to make, meant he was released, and the cycle continued. In the days before the wedding, she messaged a neighbor with a question that is difficult to read now. She asked whether she should get out, whether she should leave. She was still asking. She had not yet found the answer that felt survivable. On her wedding day, October 27th, 2021, Dawn appeared shaky. She told people she was worried something bad was going to happen. Whether that fear was instinct or lived experience or both, it sat underneath whatever joy the day was supposed to carry. The ceremony took place at the registry office in Brighouse. About 20 people attended. The reception was held at the Prince Albert pub. By all accounts, it was a happy occasion. People saw Dawn smiling. The day passed without incident. At 10:20 in the evening, she and Thomas got into a taxi and arrived home 6 minutes later. That is the last time anyone outside that house saw Dawn Walker alive. Just after midnight, Thomas was captured on CCTV at a cash point. He had pulled his hood up. He withdrew 200 pounds using Dawn's card. At 1 in the morning, he was seen in the back garden. At 5:30, a neighbor spotted him on the back step smoking a cigarette. The following morning, a neighbor stopped to speak to him. Thomas said Dawn was inside, sleeping off the wedding. But the neighbor noticed things that quietly did not fit. The curtains were still drawn. The washing that Dawn would normally have brought in was still outside. A woman described by everyone who knew her as someone always up early, always moving, always doing, was nowhere to be seen. Thomas told the neighbor she was nursing a hangover, but CCTV footage from the night before showed no signs of Dawn being heavily intoxicated when they arrived home. The image of her that the taxi captured was calm, not stumbling, not distressed in any obvious way. Whatever had happened inside that house had happened behind a closed door. In the hours after that taxi pulled away, Thomas left for the honeymoon alone. CCTV tracked the caravan all the way to Skegness and all the way back. Dawn was not in the vehicle at any point. The passenger seat had items placed on it. Her seat, in none of the footage across the entire journey did she appear. While Thomas was parked in a Labie in Skegness, chosen over a campsite or a park where he might be seen and remembered, messages were being sent from Dawn's phone. Her daughters received updates about how the honeymoon was going. One message told her daughter that as soon as she was back, she wanted to meet up. A message sent on October 30th asked to get together in Brighouse the following day so she could see her daughter and her grandson. Dawn did not send those messages. She was already dead. Her body was inside a cupboard in the kitchen of the home she had shared with the man who had just killed her on their wedding night. On the morning of October 31st, Halloween, Thomas parked the caravan back outside the house. He began putting up decorations. Police tape was among them, stretched across the front of the house. A neighbor came by and asked where Dawn was. Thomas said she had been due to meet her daughter and grandson, but had not turned up. The neighbor, trying to make light of the tension that had somehow already gathered around the morning, made a joke. They asked where he had buried her. Thomas began to cry. The neighbor had never seen him cry before. The reaction landed strangely, too much, too soon, disproportionate to what the situation publicly was. Dawn had only supposedly been gone a few hours. Something in that response stayed with the neighbor long after the conversation ended. At 12:22 in the afternoon, Thomas called the police and reported his wife missing. An officer was sent to the house that afternoon. Nobody answered at first. Thomas appeared a few minutes later and said he had been at the shop, but the officer noticed that he was sweaty. There was a wet mark on one of his knees. Thomas said he had rushed back when he realized the time. Inside, he told the officer that Dawn had seemed agitated when he last saw her. He mentioned her mental health. He said she may have stopped taking her medication. He told the officer they had spent the honeymoon in the caravan watching DVD in a Labie. He said he had spent the day driving around trying to find her. So, after the officer left, Thomas asked a neighbor to go with him to a nearby cemetery to search for Dawn. He said he was glad to have company because otherwise people might think he was out dumping a body somewhere. And then he laughed. The neighbor who heard those words felt something shift inside her, something that could not be named immediately but would not leave her alone. She went outside and spoke to her partner. A call was made to the police. The suitcase had been sitting in a field for roughly 2 hours. One of the neighbors had already found it. She had opened the zip just a few inches. She had not confirmed what she was seeing, but she knew. She came back into the kitchen where Thomas was standing, and she kept her face as still as she could. When the police arrived and cordoned off the field, it was confirmed. Inside the suitcase was the body of Dawn Walker. The forensic examination that followed was thorough and devastating. Dawn had a fractured eye socket, a large black eye, lacerations across her face, a fractured nose from blunt force to the left side of her face, bruising at her hairline, bruising inside her mouth, bruising across her neck, her collarbone, and her chest. Her right shoulder was bruised and grazed. Both arms were bruised. Her scalp was bruised. There was deep bruising to her jaw, bell. Her ribs were fractured. Her left leg was fractured in 2 places. Her thyroid cartilage had been fractured by forceful pressure applied to her neck. Her bones had been broken after death, broken deliberately to fold her body into the suitcase. She had been bent with her face toward the wheels. Her legs were contorted. Her right leg was twisted. The pathologist could not give a precise time of death, but the investigation that followed made the timeline increasingly clear. Thomas handed himself in that evening through a solicitor. He was brought into an interview room and he spoke. He described a woman who had threatened to make accusations against him again, the same kind that had sent him to jail before. He said she had come at him and scratched his face, and he had responded by hitting her and putting his arm around her neck. He said it had happened fast. He said he had not realized he was choking her. He said he had not meant to kill her. He just wanted her to stop screaming. He had hidden her body in a cupboard. He had gone on a honeymoon. He had sent messages from her phone to her children, said her children. He had come home, put up Halloween decorations, and reported her missing. The trial opened at Bradford Crown Court on July 25th, 2022. Thomas argued manslaughter. The prosecution disagreed. They did not accept that the level of force and the nature of the injuries reflected anything other than an intent to cause serious harm. The jury watched a man who remained largely unmoved throughout the proceedings. The lies were pulled apart one by one. 1. The physical reality of what the prosecution presented was difficult to dismiss. Dawn stood just 5 feet tall and was slightly built. Thomas was significantly larger and physically imposing. The idea that she had been the aggressor, that she had forced a situation in which he had no choice but to respond with that degree of violence, required a certain willingness to look past what was in front of the jury. Most people who heard it did not extend that willingness. At various points during the proceedings, Thomas changed the details. He told a prison chaplain a version that included a kitchen knife. That story did not align with anything the forensic evidence supported. When the pathologist was asked whether the injuries were consistent with a fall, the answer was that such an outcome would be extremely uncommon. Dawn's daughter sat through all of it. She had spent the days before the arrest showing photographs of her mother to neighbors, asking if anyone had seen her, while Thomas stood nearby watching, knowing exactly what had happened and where her mother was. That is the detail that does not leave easily. That is the image that her daughter has had to carry. On August 10th, after 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict. Thomas Nutt was found guilty of murder. Cheers came from the public gallery. As he was let out, he muttered something under his breath. The judge who sentenced him described the case in terms that were measured and precise. He said it remained a mystery why Thomas had chosen to kill a woman he had married only hours before. He said he did not believe Thomas had gone into that night with the specific intention of ending her life, but that he had clearly intended to cause her very serious injury. He told Thomas directly that Dawn Walker died because he was a bully civilian. He noted that Thomas had desecrated her body by breaking her bones to force her into the suitcase. Thomas received a life sentence with a minimum term of 21 years. Within a week of arriving in prison, another inmate attacked him. He was treated in hospital for minor injuries. An appeal was later filed on the grounds that the sentence was too lenient. It was rejected. Kimberly, who had spent 10 years with Thomas and had spent years since then trying to tell anyone who would listen what he was, heard the news of Don's death through a message from a stranger on Facebook. The stranger had known Don. She had reached out to say that Don had spoken of the conversations she used to have with Kimberly. Kimberly did not know what to expect. She had learned to brace herself for that kind of message. When she found out what had happened, that Don had been killed, she said what she had been saying for years before anyone thought to listen. She had known. She had told people. She had tried to warn someone who might have protected a woman like Don from ever seeing him as a possibility. That is not an easy thing to sit with. Don's sister Lisa said he had manipulated her, isolated her, and made her feel worthless before his hands took her from them. She said she mourned for a sister who suffered so much and felt like she had no one to turn to. Her daughter Cody said there are no words for what it feels like to wake up every day, knowing what was done to her mother. She said she prays he is never allowed to do this to another family. In the months that followed the conviction, Cody walked the Yorkshire 3 Peaks on the first anniversary of her mother's death. She did it to raise money for a charity that provides advocacy to families after fatal domestic abuse. She said the charity had been a ray of sunshine in the darkest stretch of her family's life. She said she wanted victims to know that there is another way, that it may be hard, but they are strong and they can get out. Dawn Walker was more than the final night of her life. She was a mother and a grandmother. She was someone who gave generously and loved openly. She had enough hope left, even after everything she had already survived, to choose happiness. She walked into a future she believed was possible, and it was stolen from her in the very hours that were supposed to mark its beginning. The people who loved her do not let her be reduced to a suitcase in a field, or a verdict, or a sentence. They carry the version of her that existed before all of it. The chirpy, generous, funny, warm woman who would hand over her last pound for someone who needed it. The grandmother who wanted to see her family grow. The soul who deserved so much more than what she was given in those She deserved a future. She deserved safety. She deserved to wake up on the morning after her wedding and feel, even briefly, that she had chosen correctly, that the hardest part was behind her. It was not, but she was loved. And those who loved her made sure the world knew her name.